Hey everybody, today's video is an update to my defense guide. The last version now has sections that are out of date because of recent changes that were made to the game, so we are providing an update to update the information that is inaccurate and hopefully to just improve the guide overall. So who's the audience for this? Anybody who's interested in making their own builds or taking other people's builds and then modifying them to better fit, your preferences with respect to your character development. Beginners and intermediate players are definitely going to get more value out of this guide, but I do think that more advanced players can pick up on some tidbits as well. So what are the topics to be covered? We're going to talk about damage calculation and, mostly on the defense side, things like the order of operations, scaling your defenses efficiently, and then layering of defenses, a concept we'll go into more later, but probably a term you've heard thrown around if you've attempted to follow any guides or watched any videos, that kind of thing. Discussion of terminology will also take place. I think it's important to make sure we're on the same page with certain definitions, especially if I'm going to end up using a term dozens of times throughout this. It's important that we know, we're on the same wavelength. You understand what I mean when I say it. And finally, there will definitely be a little bit of direct math, though I do tend to try and shift my focus to the concepts that you can draw from understanding the math, rather than necessarily having to have, a good enough handle on the math to perform the calculations yourself. So the first term that I want to specify here is the term EHP. So I say it's often misused in the PoE community. Typically, its colloquial usage in the PoE community refers to the sum total of your life, your energy shield, and then mana, if you have a way of making mana an extension of your HP pool. Now, I have a few problems with that way of using the term. Number one is that the term HP by itself already describes what you're trying to describe when you say EHP. So it seems superfluous to add the E. The E stands for effective hit points, and that term is loaded and has a meaning that is not present when you use it in that fashion. And in fact, the term EHP is used in tons of other contexts with respect to other games and things, and so it's a little confusing for anybody who's heard the term in those other contexts. And then finally, the term effective is used in other contexts within Path of Exile, more appropriately, like when people describe effective critical strike chance. For example, the impact that the lucky critical strike modifier has on your ability to critically strike enemies. So your critical strike chance does not change, but the actual chance, like the critical strike chance on your character sheet, but your actual chance to deal a critical strike to an enemy is modified by that. And so that's why the term effective is used. It's kind of like the functional, real world value as opposed to what you would see on a character sheet. And the meaning is very similar here. So let me break it down. HP, the way I'm going to use the term HP, describes the amount of damage you can take before dying. So the sum of your health, your energy shield, and mana when that's relevant. This doesn't describe how much damage the enemy has to deal to kill you, which is really what you care about, right? An enemy, you want them to be forced to deal more damage before you die. That is how you become tankier, by saying, hey, enemy, you now have to deal twice as much damage to kill me. That's the same as doubling your HP, right? Even if your HP pool doesn't actually change, if it requires them to, if the enemy has to deal double your HP pool in damage, then it doesn't really matter. The functional effect on your tankiness is the same. So on the other hand, EHP is the raw amount of damage and does describe how much damage the enemy must deal before they kill you. Now, a couple of caveats with the term. A single hit EHP is often calculated separately, and that's because there are chance-based defenses in this game, so things like block. And so you can say, well, if you have 50% block chance, on average over time, that doubles your effective health, right? It's going to take twice as much damage to kill you, on average, in the long run. But because it's chance-based, a hit that is exactly equal to the size of your HP pool if it isn't blocked, will still kill you. So a separate value is often calculated that only factors in mitigation that is applied 100% of the time. As well, multiple EHP values must be calculated, and that's because there are different types and sources of damage, and the different types of defense in this game don't generally apply universally. There are some that apply universally, but generally speaking, they only apply to certain combinations of damage types and sources. And so you need a different EHP value for each one. It's still a useful tool, though, because that EHP value allows a comparison between different potential paths for investment. If you see that one boosts your EHP of a given area more than another, then you know that it's better. Oversimplifying, but generally. Okay, so the next is the idea of return on investment. You want to get the most bang for your buck. Every passive skill point you spend, every prefix or suffix on your gear that contributes to your defense, you want to get the most return for that investment. Now, with some mechanics, investment suffers diminishing returns. So for example, when you scale hit points, it suffers diminishing returns, right? The first 100% increase to maximum life you get doubles the amount of life you have. It doubles the amount of damage it takes before you die. Now, if you already have 100% increased maximum life and you get another 100% increased, it has now only boosted the amount of damage it takes before you die by 50%. So the value has dropped in half, relatively speaking, for the second plus 100% versus the first plus 100%. And that's because it scales your effective hit points linearly. Every 100% increased maximum life is plus 100% to your effective HP pool. So there are defenses, however, where mitigation actually, like certain kinds of mitigation, greater investment in them will result in a greater return on that investment. The value actually goes up the more you invest. And that's because with certain kinds of mitigation, you approach infinite value. Now, there are artificial caps in this game, right? Like block is capped at 75% maximum. Physical damage reduction is 90% of maximum. These artificial caps prevent you from reaching true infinite EHP values. However, sometimes people do break the game and come up with ways to make their characters immortal. There is a constant battle between the developers and the community that is always trying to break the game by finding new immortal builds. But the point is they make an effort, right? That's why those limits are in place. But the point is that because they approach infinity, that means that the value must necessarily go up with more investment. So I'll showcase a little bit more what I mean with some visual aids in a moment. There's a little nuance with this with respect to Armour and Evasion. By default, they actually scale linearly or pseudo-linearly, but we're going to go into some more detail about how that can be manipulated. This is only true for aggregate multipliers, so any value where the stat is added up into one large multiplier that then modifies incoming damage. So block is a good example of that, right? You add up all your sources of block chance into one large block value, and then that is that's what's modifying incoming damage. Also, kind of in the same vein, you can take away from this that it is a bad idea to split investment between different defensive layers. And again, we'll come back to more specifically what defensive layering is, but different sources of defense that do the same thing. So for example, if you had a character with 75% physical damage reduction compared to another character that has 50% physical damage reduction and 40% less physical damage taken, which one mitigates more physical damage? The answer is the one that has 75% physical damage reduction. The other character that has 50 phys damage reduction and 40 less phys damage taken is actually only mitigating 70% of incoming damage rather than 75%. So you can see how stacking up that one multiplier to a larger value is more efficient in that case. HP, as I mentioned earlier, scales linearly, so it does suffer diminishing returns, but the advantage of scaling HP is that it's kind of universal, right? HP interacts with all incoming damage types and damage sources, whereas most defensive tools only interact with certain kinds of incoming damage. The other thing is that because all the mitigation, it's percentage scaling, they're all multipliers. The HP provides your base. You need a big enough number that you're multiplying by in order for the value to get large. So it's still important to have a big enough HP pool, but there is diminishing returns past a certain point. So you don't really have to care too much about the equation, though it's a simple one. You take 1 and you divide it by the amount of damage that you receive, and then that tells you your EHP multiplier. So you can see on this graph how scaling gets way out of control as you approach the end. Now, I cut this off at 95%. If we went all the way to 100%, it breaks the graph because that's infinity. You would be dividing by 0, right? It would be 1 divided by, if the damage taken is 0, then you have this thing that the graph doesn't know how to handle properly. So I cut it off at 95%. But the point is that you can see, right, that at something like 90% mitigation, the multiplier to your EHP is way higher even than 70 or 80%. And so taking advantage of this kind of scaling, right, trying to invest in defenses so you end up at this part of the curve right here, that's what you really want to take advantage of to get a strong defensive character. So we'll come back to this concept more as we go on. So what is defensive layering? Defensive layering, it kind of describes the combination of all the different types of defense you have and how they interact with one another. And it has two major purposes. There is the filling in of defensive gaps. So because of what I said earlier, where very few sources of defense work against all incoming types of damage, you need to mix and match those different defensive tools so that you don't have weaknesses that are exposed. You can kind of imagine layering like wearing a suit of armor, where with the armor that you're wearing, you're going to have areas where there's not as much coverage, the plating isn't as thick, and you're more exposed to potential threats. And then you're going to have other areas where, there's heavy multiple layers of material and thicker material and all that. And those areas, you're very unlikely to get injured from that standpoint. And so you can kind of visually think of the defenses on your character in that way, right? You want to minimize the number of areas that are exposed, and you want to maximize the number of areas that have multiple layers of material or very thick layers of material protecting you. And you have to mix and match different sources to get that kind of coverage, again, because most of them only work against specific damage types or sources. Another reason is that sometimes a single source might be insufficient. So you may want, let's say, defense against physical damage, but your character doesn't have very good access to armor or something like that, or the amount of armor that they can get is fairly low. So that won't be enough by itself. You need to get other sources of physical damage mitigation layered on top of that to make that area resilient enough to deal with the incoming threats. And then finally, there's redundancy. It's kind of a couple of things, because there's chance-based mitigation in this, things like block or evasion. You want to make sure that you have layers that prevent damage should those fail, should you get a bad roll and not block or not evade an incoming attack. And then also there are things that debuff you that can reduce the effectiveness of some of your defensive layers. And there are map mods that can also reduce the effectiveness of some defensive layers. And so you want additional layers underneath of that so that if something does bypass them or reduce their strength, or they fail, then you have sort of a backup to prevent you from dying. And balance is really important with this layering. You want to take advantage of that increased return on investment I was describing in the previous slides, where I said the more you invest in certain kinds of defense, the more value you get. You want to get those, you want to be able to invest enough that you get those big returns on your investment. However, you can't focus so intensely that you leave too many other areas exposed and don't have any defensive tools to deal with certain kinds of threats. So it's a little bit of a push and a pull, which I like. I think it's one of the things that makes building defenses on a character interesting and prevents the whole situation where it's just make a bigger number better. That doesn't actually work very well with defenses. I mean, yes, that concept is always important, but it's not the only thing that matters. You need the full picture to really understand. So I made a little table here kind of illustrating the meaning of the idea of defensive layering. So this column right here has the 5 different damage types in it. Physical, elemental, which includes fire, cold, and lightning, all 3. I just grouped them together. And then chaos. And then this row up here has the 3 major damage sources that you care about. So if I talk about type, I'm talking about these. If I talk about source, I'm talking about these. Technically, there's a couple of other damage sources, but these are the 3 you really only have to take into consideration to make a well-rounded character defensively. The others would be reflected damage and secondary damage, but it's not really worth talking about those. But I'll just mention them for completeness sake. So anyway, you can see that there are certain defensive tools that kind of check more boxes than others, right? All these different combinations that are possible between the different damage types and sources. So every bit of incoming damage is going to be of a type and of a source. You need one of each. And so again, here we're showcasing which defensive layers apply to each. This is not a complete list, of course, I just chose a sampling. But you can see how filled in this box is up here. So this character has a lot of defensive layers that contribute to mitigating attack physical damage, armor, percent physical damage reduction, fortify, block, life regeneration. All of these things help to deal with physical attacks. In the opposite corner, you have very few layers that interact with damage over time that is chaos damage. It's just chaos resistance and life regeneration. I did also try to organize this in a way that the top left represents the most common damage type, and then kind of as you move to the right and down, the most common damage type and source. And as you move right and down, the type and source becomes less common. So physical attacks are the most common combination of damage type and source in the game, and chaos damage over time would be the least common. This might not be perfect, but kind of very generally speaking, this is a reasonable representation of how often you encounter these threats. So, order of operations. When damage comes in at your character, how is the damage modified through mitigation and all that? So, first of all the incoming damage is calculated on the enemy side. So, any things that boost their damage, things like increased monster damage or something like that, that will take place first. The next is hit prevention. So basically now that only refers to evasion. When dodge was in the game, it referred to dodge. Technically it refers to spell dodge, but that is much more niche and difficult to get. Most characters will not have spell dodge. So anyway, that's the next thing that takes place. Then damage taken as, this is sometimes called damage shifting, I think is how the wiki refers to it. We'll go into more detail about that very shortly. Then there's damage mitigation, and I was not sure if spell suppression happens at this stage. I couldn't confirm this. Ultimately, though, it actually doesn't matter too much because multiplication operations are commutative in nature, meaning that you can multiply numbers together in any order you want. It doesn't matter how many terms you have, and the result will be the same. You can mix and match. 3 times 5 times 7 is the same as 7 times 5 times 3. The order doesn't matter. Then there's a term called damage taken, which takes place at the next step. It's usually reduce or less damage taken in the ways that we care, but things can cause you to take increased damage taken here as well. Then block and spell block take place, and then damage redirection. So this is referring to redirecting damage to like a temporary shield or something like that. So let's get into more detail about those different steps. So first we have evasion. Evasion is capped at 95%. What that means is that it is capped at multiplying your effective HP pool by 20. If you have 95% chance to evade, then you have 20 times the effective HP pool against incoming attacks. With the, single hit EHP caveat that I described earlier, something that you should keep in mind. If you evade an attack, you fully prevent the hit. It is though you are never hit, and therefore on-hit effects don't apply. So if you evade an attack, for example, you can't be shocked by that attack. It only interacts with attacks, but it does interact, so that's the only damage source it cares about, but it interacts with all damage types. It doesn't matter if it's physical, elemental, or chaos. That damage will all be prevented as long as it's from an attack. And it does have an indirect effect on damage over time in that some damage over time is applied by hit. So if you avoid the hit, then you avoid the application of that damage over time in the first place. Poison, ignite, and bleed all fall under this category. So if you evade a hit, it cannot cause you to bleed, ignite, or be poisoned. But once the damage over time is applied to you, the evasion has no effect on it. Chance to evade considers enemy accuracy. So if an enemy does have their accuracy modified either positively or negatively, it will change your chance to evade. Higher accuracy means they're more likely to hit you. And it follows an entropy-based system rather than one of pure chance. So I'm going to describe this briefly, but just keep in mind, I have an entire video about the entropy system called In Defense of Entropy. The summary being that in the long run for your character, it is always better to have this entropy-based system in place rather than relying on something that is completely chance-based. And there may be very specific cherry-picked scenarios you can describe where the chance-based system can save you, and this would not save you. But just trust me when I say that over the lifetime of your character, that this type of system is superior. And if you don't believe me, watch my video. I explain my rationale in more detail in that video. But the purpose of it is that it prevents streaks of success and failure. So under normal circumstances, with random rolls, you can have streaks of success or failure. If you flip a coin 100 times, throughout those 100 trials, you're going to have instances where you flip heads a few times in a row and you flip tails a few times in a row, even though in the long run, on average, it's going to be 50-50 between the two. This system prevents that from happening. It essentially takes the coin flip and makes it so that you can predictably say, in 100 trials, you will see exactly 50 heads and exactly 50 tails, and it will happen in sequence. Heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, all the way on up. So if you have 50% evade chance, that's exactly what happens. You'll evade an attack, then you'll fail to evade. You will evade, you'll fail to evade, etc. So the one exception to this is that if you have not been hit in the last few seconds, then your entropy counter resets, and the very first time an enemy tries to attack you after a few second break, that first hit will be randomly generated, and then the entropy system is used from that point on. I mean, really, that is a piece of the entropy system, but I digress. The last thing to mention is that critical strikes perform a separate evasion check. So what that means is that first, it's determined whether or not you're going to get hit. If your evasion check fails, that means you're going to get hit. Now, if an enemy then rolls a critical strike, you actually have a chance to evade the bonus damage from the critical strike as well. So it's quite an effective defensive layer at dealing with critical strikes, from attacks anyway. But that's very powerful, forcing the bonus damage to also go through an evasion check. Okay, so we have a graph and we have an equation here. You can mostly ignore the equation. I just kind of, again, threw it up there for completeness. This is the chance to evade equation, but I have put it in graph form to make it sort of more, visually salient here. And so on the x-axis here, we have the evasion rating of your character, and on the y-axis, we have the EHP multiplier that's being applied to your character for a given evasion rating. Now, this blue line describes, it says base accuracy, and it describes the accuracy on an enemy in a level 84 zone. Basically, all enemies have the same accuracy rating. There are some exceptions, but the vast majority of the time, you can assume this line to be an accurate representation of almost all monsters in a level 84 zone. Now notice that the line is almost linear. I'm calling it pseudo-linear scaling because technically this is not a linear function. However, it is so darn close to being linear in practice that you can kind of think of it as linear scaling. So what that means is that evasion by default suffers diminishing returns, as I described earlier with linear functions. But there are ways to modify this. So first, we have modifying enemy accuracy. So this red line represents a situation where the enemy has 20% less accuracy than the baseline value. I chose this because that's what blind does. So against a blinded enemy, this red line represents how your EHP scales with evasion. So notice it's significantly better, but it's still linear or pseudo-linear. Basically, this line represents you having about 30% more evasion rating, and it also equates to, and it's not perfect throughout, but it equates to being something around 20% more EHP. And that number actually scales up with higher investment, and it doesn't reach 20% until you have about, it's like 10 or 12,000 evasion rating. But as long as you're making a reasonable investment into evasion, the EHP multiplier boost is pretty substantial and is in the neighborhood of 20%. It's slightly better than 20% as you start to get to higher evasion investment. So now look at these lines. Notice these are not linear functions anymore. So what I've done here is I've graphed out what it looks like if your character has plus 8% evade chance on top of whatever evasion rating is listed down here. This is no longer a linear function. This now approaches infinity. And so you can see how just this plus 8% chance dramatically boosts the effect on your AHP for a given amount of investment in evasion. To reach the cap, the 95% chance to evade cap just through evasion rating, it takes it's something like 185,000 evasion, 184,000. I forget the exact number, but it's in the 180s. Notice if you have plus 8% evade chance, it takes something like 60,000. Again, I'm just going off the visual here. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like a third. It's like tripling the value of your evasion rating investment. So if you're going to try and hit that cap and you're really going to try and use evasion as like one of your primary defensive layers, get this stat if you can. It's very hard to find. I'm actually only aware of it existing on Watcher's Eye jewels now, but also the Raider Ascendancy, the 10% more chance to evade, kind of has the same effect because it's directly modifying chance to evade and not your evasion rating. So it's a similar effect. This is actually a little more powerful in most circumstances, but at the extremes, they're close to equal. This final line here just represents a situation where you have both plus 8 evade chance and the enemy has less accuracy. So you can see the line still follows this approaching infinity curve, but it gets steeper a bit faster. So now you need a less than 50,000 evasion rating if you have both of these stats in order to hit the 95% evade cap. So what I'm saying is the bottom line, if you're going to invest substantially in evasion, then plus evade chance or more chance to evade are extremely important. They're the most powerful thing you can do to augment your evasion, and then modifying enemy accuracy is also very powerful, but less powerful. Damage taken as, or damage shifting, as I believe the wiki calls it. So when your character receives damage, you can make it so that some portion of incoming damage is shifted from one type to another. Just to be very specific with language, this is not considered conversion. Conversion only happens when you're dealing damage. But the effect is kind of the same. It's the sort of the conversion equivalent on the defense side. This occurs before mitigation is calculated. This is key to understanding some of the next concepts we'll talk about. But hold that thought for just 1 second. It does interact with all damage sources by default. So if you see text like this here, 50% of elemental damage taken as chaos damage, it does indeed apply to damage over time, unless otherwise specified. And it is specified otherwise quite often. So I've showcased an example of one of those restrictions. This is the lightning coil, and you'll see it says 30% of physical damage from hits taken as lightning damage. So this will only apply to hit damage, attack and spell damage, and actually also the secondary damage sources in theory. So 100% of damage taken as a different type is possible, so you can fully shift the incoming damage from one type to another. This is incredibly powerful, because if you can fully shift the damage from one type to another, it means you don't need any defense against the type you're shifting away from. If you don't take any damage of a particular type, you don't need any defense against it. And so what this does is it reduces the need for layering, or sort of the reverse way to think about it is it allows you to focus your investment more in other layers and take advantage of that better than linear scaling, that big return on investment that I was talking about earlier. And it's letting you leverage those defenses, right? If you take 30% of physical damage from hits as lightning damage, well, now any extra investment you've made in preventing lightning damage will apply to your physical damage to some extent. So it's an incredibly powerful defensive mechanic if you can utilize it effectively. So that's why I say it kind of also allows you to neglect some defenses. It is very powerful against penetration and resistance reduction as well. Penetration and resistance reduction are extremely dangerous in this game. And the fact that the damage is being received as a different type means that the penetration won't be applying to the portion you've shifted to a different type. So it reduces the effectiveness of those mechanics. If you completely shift the damage away, then it makes those mechanics useless. If an enemy penetrates cold resistance, but you shift all of the incoming cold damage to fire, their penetration does nothing. Sorry, Shaper. Next is Elemental and Chaos Resist. So some of the more commonly understood defensive mechanics in the game. They are capped at 75% by default, though this cap can be raised to a maximum of 90%. It interacts with all damage sources. It doesn't care if it's an attack, a spell, damage over time. It works against all of them, unless otherwise specified, though the vast majority of the time, there is no qualifier here. But there are some instances where a resistance will apply to only damage over time or something. Overcapped values are relevant. So if your character, for example, has 100% fire resist, as you're going throughout the world fighting enemies, you will take damage as though you have 75% fire resistance because that's the cap. But the game knows that you're sitting at 25% above the cap. So if an enemy attempts to reduce your fire resistance by 25, it will actually have no effect on you because it reduces that overcapped value. So you'll go down from 100 to 75. Now, if an enemy tried to reduce your resistance from, and you were exactly at the cap, you had exactly 75%, you would go from 75 to 50 and you would take double damage from that enemy. Penetration does not work like this. Penetration doesn't care about your overcapped value. It only cares about sort of the value that's used in the mitigation calculations. Resistance can be reduced into negative values, and you can also be penetrated into negative values. So It's very rare you're going to encounter this situation on the receiving end of damage. When you're dealing damage, this comes up more often. But just for completeness sake, I'm mentioning it. If you do have your resistances reduced or penetrated into the negatives, it's like taking more damage relative to having 0 resist. So if you get reduced to minus 20 resist of some kind, you will take 20% more damage than if you had 0 resist against that threat. Actually, I shouldn't say that it never happens, because chaos damage oftentimes can sit at fairly low values. So worth considering for that. All right. So, one other quick thing to mention here. The scaling of this is that better than linear, that approaching infinite type scaling. So if you can get your maximum resists up to 90%, you will take 60% less damage from whatever type you have 90% resist of compared to 75. So very powerful. Physical damage reduction. It is capped at 90%, and there are kind of two pieces to it. There is armor, and then there is direct physical damage reduction. So the differences between them. Armor has no interaction at all with damage over time. The percent damage reduction that you get from it is larger versus smaller hits, aka it is smaller versus bigger hits. So bigger hits sort of pseudo penetrate your armor. And when the total physical damage reduction calculation is done, the percent damage reduction you get from armor is aggregated with any sources you have of percent physical damage reduction. So things like endurance charges. So on the other side, percent physical damage reduction does indeed interact with damage over time. So reduces damage from something like bleed. And it doesn't care about the hit size. The percent reduced is the same no matter the size of the incoming hit. So let's talk about how armor scales a little bit. So I say linear scaling in a vacuum. Armor does indeed have true linear scaling. So every 5 times the amount of incoming damage in armor you have gives you plus 100% physical hit EHP. Now, you can alter this. And in this graph, you can see I have listed for this character different armor values and the effect that it has on your EHP multiplier, assuming the incoming hit size is 5,000. So I made this graph to capture a situation where it's a pretty big hit that's coming in. Now, keep in mind, these curves actually look exactly the same. If you were to make this equivalent graph for different hit sizes, these curves look exactly the same, just the scale down here would be different. You wouldn't, the armor values would be lower, right? You wouldn't need as much armor to reach the damage mitigation caps and stuff like that. But the curve still looks the same. So if you have only armor, it requires, 225,000 armor. I think it's 45 times the incoming damage, right? So that's, 225,000 armor to get 90% physical damage reduction from armor alone. That's extremely hard to get. It is possible, but it's extremely hard to get in this game under normal circumstances. But notice what happens if I give the character 12 or 24% physical damage reduction layered on top of this armor. So this represents, I chose 12% because this is if your character has 3 endurance charges. Pretty easy to get. I mean, relative to a lot of other powerful defensive layers. And then, so the yellow line represents having 6 endurance charges, or however you have your percent physical damage reduction. So notice how the value of armor goes up dramatically if you have even just a little bit of physical damage reduction. This is very similar to what we saw with Evasion and the flat added chance to evade. So if you are going to build a character that cares about armor and is investing substantially in armor, get some endurance charges. It will make the armor investment a lot more efficient by a long shot. Notice, with the character, even with 3 endurance charges, we're talking about requiring substantially less than half the armor to get the same value against a 5,000 damage hit, aka it's kind of like having more than double your armor. That's insane. And this down here is like having more than quadruple your armor if you have 24% physical damage reduction against a 5,000 damage hit. So get yourself some percent physical damage reduction to pair with your armor, is what I'm saying, if you're going to build armor on your character. All right, next is spell suppression. So this is one of the mechanics that didn't exist when I made my last guide. It's very powerful, but it's very straightforward too. So you have a chance to cut incoming spell damage in half, and that mitigation level can scale slightly. It can go from 50 to something like 53 or 55%. I don't know the exact numbers, but it can be scaled up slightly. You can have 100% chance to suppress spell damage. If you have a 100% chance to suppress spell damage, then all incoming spell damage will be cut in half. It only interacts with spell hits, and it does interact with all damage types of physical, elemental, and chaos, as long as it is spell damage. I just threw in one little quick mention that it is really powerful for bossing in particular. In general, mapping, a lot of the incoming damage is hit damage. Bosses, I would say that a disproportionate number of their mechanics are spells compared to sort of just like the average pool of enemies. So that is what makes it more powerful, because it just has more relevance, right? It interacts with more boss mechanics than average monster mechanics. It's good always, right? It's a very strong mechanic, period. But I think it is particularly powerful with bossing. Okay, next is damage taken. So reduced damage taken, less damage taken, or minus damage taken. It can interact with all damage, but many sources specify restrictions. But if you do see something that just says 10% reduced damage taken, 10% less damage taken, and there's no other specifics identified, then it does apply to all damage types and sources. However, most, I would say, sources of damage reduction and less damage do in fact specify something more specific than that. It'll say from hits or from spells or whatever. It is uncapped. There is no limit. You can theoretically stack 100% reduced damage taken and take no damage, though I don't think that's possible in the current state of the game. Though somebody might find a way. You never know. It's been done before. The term reduced damage taken refers to damage taken sources that are aggregated together into one larger number. So this is kind of the more powerful of the two, if you can stack a little bit of it. And less damage taken, those do not aggregate and are simply different multipliers. Some sources of less damage taken, though, do have stacks that aggregate. I would say Fortify is probably the most common example of this. So Fortify, every stack of it gives you 1% less damage taken, but the number of stacks you have, all those add up to one single multiplier. So if you have 20 stacks of Fortify, you have 20% less damage taken from hits. So the stacks aggregate, but still that total value will always be multiplied against the other sources of damage taken, reduced or less. Also, if you do have some source of flat damage, like minus damage taken, like what is pictured here on the Immortal Flesh Belt, minus 50 to 40 physical damage taken from attack hits, that actually does kick in before the percent damage taken. And this is relevant because addition and subtraction do not, subtraction is, does not have the commutative property does not exist for that, and you can't do it in whatever order you want, and at least if it's mixed with multiplication and other things. So as a result, it actually matters. It changes the outcome of the calculation. Now, ultimately, this isn't something you have to be overly concerned with. It's hard to get very much of this stat, though I feel like it's worth mentioning in case that stat becomes more readily available as time goes on. Okay, next we have block and spell block. Again, I think this is one of the more simple mechanics. It does indeed follow that same kind of approaching infinity type scaling. So getting to the cap is very useful, and the cap is 75% by default for both block and spell block. The cap can be raised, and as far as I know, there's no actual hard-coded limit on the maximum amount of block you can have. However, it's kind of soft capped because there are only limited sources for it. So as of right now, I don't think you can achieve more than 90% or so. It fully prevents the damage from any hit that gets blocked. It interacts with attacks. Spell block interacts with spells, as you might imagine from the name. It is a truly random chance. There is no entropy system at play here. And you are still considered to be hit when blocking. Sort of. Generally, negative on-hit effects are actually prevented. This is kind of the rule of thumb. So, for example, if you block a hit that would have applied a bleed, the bleed will not get applied to you. It'll prevent shock, things like that. Positive on-hit effects, however, should trigger. So if you get some kind of bonus when you get hit, like if you get life gain when you are hit by an enemy or something like that, if you've been hit recently, get a bonus to your damage, something along those lines, those on-hit effects should still take place. There have been times in the past where this was not true, but generally it was fixed later. So it's pretty safe to assume this to be true virtually all the time. I'm not aware of any exceptions that exist in the game right now. Okay, so next is Energy Shield. Energy Shield is another source of HP. It is indeed subject to linear scaling. And damage always goes to Energy Shield before it goes to life, unless it's Chaos damage. Chaos damage actually completely ignores Energy Shield. So it's the only potential source of HP that actually isn't truly universal, because there is a damage type that ignores it. But it does interact with all other damage. And there are ways to get around this downside of Chaos damage ignoring Energy Shield. So one is that you could just have enough life that you don't really need it to contribute. But you can also take the Chaos Inoculation Keystone that makes your character immune to Chaos damage. And then there's also the stat Chaos damage does not bypass Energy Shield, as pictured here on Chevron's wrappings. And I think there's actually even another mechanic that can help out in this regard. But basically those two make it so that your Energy Shield does indeed either interact with Chaos damage, or you're immune to Chaos damage, and so it doesn't matter that it doesn't interact with it because you will never take any. Any character that has any amount of Energy Shield when they're hit has a 50% chance to avoid stun. This is multiplicative with other sources, so another 50% chance to avoid stun will not make you immune to stun. Instead, it will give you a 75% chance to avoid stun because of the multiplicative nature. It recharges if you have not taken damage for 2 seconds. And when it starts to recharge, it will recharge 1/3 of your maximum Energy Shield per second. And you can actually scale that recharge rate. You can make it higher, and you can also reduce the delay before it kicks in. And there's also some tools to make it so that taking damage does not interrupt this recharge beginning. Damage taken from mana before life. So people probably most know this or think of these as mind over matter builds. That's only because mind over matter is the largest source of this stat in the game. But the stat is available in other places. So I've pictured here a unique item where you can obtain it, and there's other items that you can find it on. There's even an ascendancy, the Hierophant Ascendancy, that can give you the stat. Basically what it does is it makes it so mana becomes an additional source of HP. So damage actually gets redirected to mana before it hits your life pool. It does indeed interact with all damage, and the different sources of this add together. So you can actually get it so that more than half of incoming damage goes to your mana pool before it goes to life. And one of the advantages of this is that, first of all, for some characters, it's a little easier to scale mana than it is to scale life, depending on where you are on the skill tree and the kind of gear you want to run and that type of thing. But also, it has a base regeneration of 1.8% max mana regenerated per second, and you can find pretty plentiful sources of percent increased mana regeneration that scale that base. So you can get quite high amounts of mana regeneration. Okay, next let's talk about guard skills. Too important to pass up. I dedicate a few slides to these just because of how powerful they are, but I'll try to be quick on them. So guard skills all share a cooldown. If they have the guard tag, then their cooldown is shared. You can only have one active at a time, which kind of comes with the fact that their cooldown is shared. And the cooldown does not recover while the skill is active, but if you use any of the guard skills that give you a temporary shield, if that shield is broken before the time would run out because you've taken enough damage to break that shield, then the skill is no longer considered to be active, and the cooldown recovery will in fact start if your shield is broken. They are instant cast, which is great. It means you can put them on left click, but also if you want, I actually really don't like doing that, but a lot of people do. And also it can be triggered. So you can put it with a cast when damage taken setup or something like that. Very common. It does get modified by duration and cooldown modifiers if you want to improve the uptime of these skills. So there are shield type guard skills. Those are Molten Shell, Steel Skin, and Arcane Cloak. And they have synergy with high mitigation because the mitigation kicks in before the shield, means that the EHP multiplier that I described earlier is applied functionally to your shield as well. So pairs really well with high mitigation. There's one mitigation guard skill, which is Immortal Call. And so therefore it has synergy with high HP and HP recovery. Okay. And that's because the mitigation applies to all of your HP pool and to any HP that you recover thereafter. So what is the primary means of scaling for each one? For Molten Shell, it's Armour. Secondarily, you get a little value out of gem level going up. Steel Skin, it's totally gem level alone. Also worth noting that Steel Skin does give you immunity to bleed, which is quite nice. Arcane Cloak scales with mana, and again, secondarily with levels. And then finally, Immortal Call scales with endurance charges primarily. So endurance charges scale both the duration and the physical damage mitigation portion of the skill. Worth noting that this skill is pretty darn effective. Even if you're just using a level 1 gem and don't have any endurance charges, it's still probably worth slotting into your build somewhere. Next is Ward, and I almost wasn't going to talk about this because there just isn't great support for this mechanic in the game right now, but probably worth talking about in case additional support is added later. But it is considered a global defense, so I haven't used this term yet, but if you see the term global defense, it describes armor, evasion, energy shield, and ward. It interacts with hits, but not damage over time, and any damage that hits it fully depletes it. So it's basically a shield that immediately goes away no matter how much damage it interacts with. Then after 5 seconds, the shield is instantly restored to full, and taking damage does not reset this timer. Damage is redirected after mitigation, so you probably want to pair it with other sources of mitigation. And because of the fact that any damage at all will cause the shield to go away, means that in my mind, evasion and block pair the best with ward, because it will make sure that the uptime is the highest, that it is more likely to be up when you need it. It also doesn't have very good support for hybrid setups, so there's no scaling that I know of, unless you see something that says just % increased global defense, but there's nothing tuned specifically to help you scale both ward and evasion or ward and armor at the same time. Okay, so So next we're going to talk about recovery. I don't know if this graph here is really necessary, but just to kind of conceptualize why recovery is so important. If your character had no recovery source for their HP, any enemy DPS value would be enough to kill you eventually, right? Unless you kill the enemy first, of course. But in theory, if you never recovered any, then eventually you would die, no matter how much damage the enemy is dealing. So your goal is to raise the enemy time to kill to infinity, because if it's infinity, it means you don't die. And of course, one-shots can bypass this, right? It doesn't matter if you can recover your HP quickly if you die in a single hit, but just worth noting that recovery also kind of has this better than linear scaling effect, where what happens is as you have more recovery, because you can reach that point where your time to kill becomes infinite, you get this incredible boost to, in this case, time to kill rather than EHP. In a way, it's kind of boosting your EHP because the HP that you recovered also contributes to your HP pool. So it's sort of like saying you have infinite HP if you recover damage faster than it's coming in. So I just made a little graph here to showcase the kind of scaling you can expect. It's not too complicated, but basically this plots down here recovery in HP per second. Then this shows the time to kill in seconds, assuming that you have 6,000 HP and the enemy is dealing 2,000 damage per second to you. Right? So you can see once you hit 2,000, this would be infinite, right? They can never kill you. So I cut it off there, and the graph starts to look weird because it can't handle divide by zeros very well. But anyway, you can see that as you approach that, you really dramatically raise the time to kill. Now, of course, you don't actually need to make time to kill infinite. It just needs, the time to kill just needs to be longer than the time that they would take to kill you, or give you enough time to take cover, to use some kind of temporary buff that will give you a larger boost to mitigation, or more rapidly recover your HP than you do under normal circumstances, to portal out of the zone you're in. It, gives you a chance to respond to the incoming threat. So we're going to talk a bunch about recovery now. So first is Leech. I'm going to do my best to make this explanation succinct. There are some great guides out there for understanding Leech. There's an entire hour-long video that somebody put out. I'll try to find the link and put it in the description. But I'm not going to go into that kind of detail, but it is worth talking about the Leech mechanics a bit because Leech is incredibly powerful. So, Leech is made of instances that are created on hit. Each instance can recover a total of 10%. I say maximum life, though technically this works for ES and for mana as well. But the recovery is limited to 2% per second. So this is the total amount that can be recovered. This is the amount per second. So you can see that if you do reach this cap, if you deal enough damage to leech 10% in a single instance, that instance will last for 5 seconds because it gets depleted at 2% per second. Total recovery from all the instances together can be 20%. So by default, for Life Leech, it will take 10 instances of Leech stacked together that are active to reach 20%. It's worth keeping in mind that you can actually have any number of instances active at any given time. Some of them will just be ignored. Anything that causes you to exceed this cap will just be ignored, but technically they will still be taking place. If you have Energy Shield Leech, then it's 10% of maximum energy shield as opposed to 20% that is the cap for all the instances combined together. The stats are the same for mana, so if you have Mana Leech, then these rules all basically apply. And it's also worth noting that all Leech instances are removed at full life. So you basically can't start stacking up instances while you're sitting on full life. You have to be in a damaged state. One exception is Overleech. I think in the game it's actually phrased more specifically to say something like, Leech is not, effects of Leech don't go away at full life, or something along those lines. But it's colloquially referred to as Overleech. Okay, so these are the 3 stats that can all scale your Leech. You can read into these a little bit more if you want, but the essence of them is that increased maximum recovery per Leech increases the duration that an instance lasts. Increased total recovery per second from Leech increases the rate that you ramp up to reaching your cap. So each instance will recover more life per second, and therefore it takes fewer instances to reach your total cap. And then increased maximum total recovery per second from Leech raises the cap. So instead of being 20%, like on this last slide, you can get it up to 30, 40. You can get it pretty darn high in this game, 50, 60, I think even more. So those are the key things to remember. I'm not going to go into much more detail than that because I think it will confuse things, but just remember, this is if you want to make the Leech instance last longer. This is if you want to have it take fewer instances to stack up to get you to your cap, and this is to raise the cap. That's what those stats do. Okay, next we have Regeneration. Regeneration is nice because it is always active, and so it kicks in instantly, therefore, the moment you need it. And technically it's happening while you're at full too, but you can see it kick in instantly. Flat and percent of max sources are aggregated. So if you have 100 life regenerated a second and 2% of maximum life regenerated per second, both of them get aggregated together to be your base regeneration. And then percent increased regeneration rate will scale that base. Just a quick shout out to Enduring Cry. It's really, really strong, and it can give you a temporary boost of it's like 2,000 something life regenerated a second at maximum gem level. So worth slotting this in if you can. The regeneration isn't the only reason to do it, but it is extremely nice. Okay, next are Flasks. Flasks are also pretty straightforward, but I would be doing a disservice not to mention them at least briefly. Just be aware that they recover different amounts and at different rates depending on the type of flask and the modifiers on that flask. The flask effect, similar to Leech, it ends as soon as you reach maximum life. And there is something called Flask Life Rate Recovery modifier, which does indeed end up reducing the duration of the flask, but makes you recover that same amount more quickly. It is generally desirable to have a faster recovery rate at the expense of duration. There's also a mechanic called Recoup. So I added this slide in because now Recoup is much more available. It used to be a more niche mechanic, but they seem to be pushing to make it kind of a more core recovery mechanic in the game. But the way it works is that a percentage of the damage that you take is recovered over the next 4 seconds. Now this only works against hit damage, but it also kicks in instantly in response to taking this damage. And it is indeed considered recovery, so you see this little asterisk down here. If you have a stat that says increased recovery rate, like increased life recovery rate, then it will affect Recoup. And it does persist on reaching full life, ES, or mana. And there are actually sources of Recoup for all of them. And you can get this number, as far as I know, as high as you want. I'm not aware of any cap. In fact, I don't see why it couldn't go over 100%. So anyway, here's an example of an item that can get you that 100% all in one item, but you can stack on top of that if you want. Reduced extra damage from critical strikes. This is another one I didn't mention in the last version of my presentation, but I do think is worth mentioning because now it is a more available stat than it used to be. But it applies before mitigation, right? It's the only way to know what portion of the damage is from critical strikes, but also it makes it work well with Armour because Armour cares about the raw incoming damage. So you will get higher percent damage reduction values applied to hits if you can remove the bonus crit damage from them, right? You're making it a smaller hit, so you get higher percent DR. It can aggregate up to 100%. If that's the case, you don't take any bonus damage from crits, but the hit will still be considered a critical hit for anything that triggers in response to you being hit by a critical strike. But at that point, it will just be sort of a flag. It will not actually deal any additional damage to you. And again, it only affects the bonus damage. So you can't make a hit deal less than a non-critical hit with that stat. Utility flasks. So utility flasks are extremely varied in their their defensive properties. It's worth mentioning that there's a lot of really good unique ones. I pictured Taste of Hate here. There's Rumi's Concoction. There's actually some interesting ward flasks that are unique. All kinds of stuff. All kinds of powerful defensive unique flasks. So I definitely suggest taking a look at them. Flasks last the entire duration, except if you activate them again, then it will reset the duration, the timer to the beginning of that duration. The game now has Enkindling and Instilling Orbs. So Enkindling Orbs give you more flask power, but with worse uptime. Basically, you don't recover your flask charges while they're active if you have an Enkindling Orb applied, and in exchange you get some kind of boost to power, the flask effect, the duration, something like that. But uptime may actually improve for bosses, and if you're really selective about using your flasks only at times that you actually need them, then you can make it so your uptime is actually improved for the most dire scenarios, because there are Enkindling Orb effects that increase the amount of charges that you do recover when you are recovering them. But in most cases, for just like normal mapping, it will make you have worse uptime. Instilling Orbs can be used to automate flasks, which is really powerful because you can have flasks that kick in if you get shocked or chilled or frozen, those kinds of status effects in response to taking a big hit, all kinds of stuff like that. So you can effectually, functionally turn them into kind of trigger flasks. If you have enough micromanagement already, you can remove some micromanagement out of the character package and instead have some functions be automated for you. Auras and reservation skills. So this is like extremely generic, this slide. I almost wanted to take it out or something, but they're just too important not to mention. The essence of it, though, is that there are a ton of them, and they are worth looking into. Determination and Grace in particular are very strong right now. But there's a ton of different defensive effects. You can get things that affect Energy Shield, Armor, Evasion, Life Regeneration, Block, all kinds of stuff. Or at least Spell Block. You can get immunities from them. You can get things that debuff your enemies, like apply blind to them. All kinds of interesting effects. Our effects do work on allies, so if you plan to play with friends, you can take advantage of somebody running different auras than you. The effects of their auras will be applied to you. Specifically for auras, not all reservation skills, though. Just keep in mind some buffs are actually auras, and you might not realize it. The big one that comes to mind, though this isn't relevant defensively, is Smite. Smite gives you bonus lightning damage, but it's in the form of an aura. So just be aware that some buffs are actually auras, and you might not even realize that that's the case. And that's relevant because there are different sources of investment. One of them is Aura Effect, which increases the power of the auras you are running. And then there's Reservation Efficiency, which allows you to reserve less mana or life for a given reservation skill, and therefore have room to reserve mana or life for some different reservation skill. And next we have Keystones. Again, this is a situation where I'm going to be kind of vague because it would take forever to cover all the different Keystones in the game. But the bottom line is that, again, there is an extremely wide range of defensive effects, and it typically involves some really awesome bonus in exchange for some kind of trade-off. Just as a quick example, Glancing Blows doubles your block and spell block chance. But now, instead of fully blocking hits when you take damage, you only partially block them and you take some of the damage. And it's worth mentioning that they can be found on both Cluster and Timeless Jewels. In particular, Timeless Jewels can have some very powerful Keystones on them. Divine Flesh, Transcendence, all these kinds of things that people have used in builds pretty regularly for a while now. And it's also worth mentioning that there's a lot of just general utility that's hard to categorize any more specifically than that. So I list a bunch of different stuff here, dealing with debuffs and status effects from enemies, movement speed for manual dodging of things, temporary buffs, on and on. It's not worth just rattling off a list here, but just keep in mind that there are other utility type effects like these that you should keep an eye out for. Some of them are more important for some characters than others. And then there's the Pantheon. The Pantheon was actually reworked significantly in 3.16. It's a pretty great way to add some additional defensive layers, and it's really nice because it is adaptable. You can change your Pantheon powers pretty readily from when you're in your hideout. So if you're going to go fight a particular boss, you could shift the Pantheon powers you're using or something like that. They made it a really good source for ailment and status management. So things like dealing with shock or dealing with stun or dealing with freeze or chill, etc. You can find those kinds of tools on the Pantheon. And there's also just some difficult to acquire stats. So things like percent physical damage reduction, modifiers that reduce damage over time. So all kinds of stuff that it's tough to acquire elsewhere. Next, we have damage. I know this seems weird, but damage does have defensive value, and for a few different reasons. Number one is, first of all, if you kill something before it can attack you, obviously that's really powerful. That's a great way to fully mitigate any incoming damage, is by never letting it happen in the first place, by murdering them instantly. But also, it prevents you from being overwhelmed, right? If you kill stuff fast enough, then the enemies can't accumulate around you and swarm you. So it will prevent those situations where you can no longer handle the incoming threat. There are a lot of on-kill bonuses that exist in this game, generating flask charges, generating charges like frenzy or endurance charges, damages bonuses, all kinds of different stuff. So maintaining those will keep your character power up. If you don't deal enough damage, it's hard to maintain all those bonus effects. You can inflict more powerful status effects on enemies, so things like stun or freeze that, crowd control the enemy. Those effects are more powerful when you deal more damage. And also it's worth noting that for some bosses, there's kind of like soft enrages in the form of arena degens, where there are these damage over time effects that get placed on the ground, and eventually it becomes virtually impossible to fight the boss because so much of the ground is covered with those damage over time pools. So killing the bosses before they're able to start soft and raging like that is really powerful as well. Finally, at the end. So the summary, with all this rambling, is that when you are building defenses on a character, you need to make sure you have balanced layering. Again, you're investing into specific areas of defense to get those increased return on investment, like I described earlier. Take advantage of those that use that approach infinity function instead of linear scaling, to really get a lot of value out of your investment, but at the same time diversifying enough so that you don't have glaring weaknesses to certain kinds of threats. Pick the right utility for your character. If you're going to be running through monsters, make sure you have phasing. If you don't have access to good mobility skills, maybe you need more movement speed, etc., etc. Make stuff content specific. Do you just want to be a generalist, or are you doing something hyper specific like deep delving or farming a particular boss? Because in those cases, you can focus on certain defensive layers in a really informed kind of way to deal with the particular content. Using temporary steroids properly, things like guard skills or focus or flasks, etc. Using those effectively is really powerful, but you don't want to stack up so many that you can't micromanage your character effectively. Because if you're not able to call on those temporary steroids at the best times, they become a lot weaker. Making sure that you haven't invested so much in defense that your character, doesn't do any damage. First of all, it's going to feel like butt to play your character. There's just no other way to put it. It feels terrible if your character doesn't really deal any damage. But again, like I said, there's actually some defensive value to having a certain amount of damage. After a certain point, that diminishes significantly, but definitely there's some payoff to making sure you don't hit like a total wet noodle. And then finally, there's the whole theory versus practice thing. If in Path of Building or on spreadsheets, you say, oh, my EHP value looks like this, I should feel really tanky. But then you realize that, certain threat types are more threatening than you realized, or kind of certain utility things that you didn't think were very important are actually more important than they are, or certain status effects that you thought you could get away with ignoring that you can't. You just sometimes need to get out there and start playing, and then really use actual experience to inform the further changes you want to make. So I like how building defense in this game is really kind of more of an art than a science. It's like an art that is informed by science, because you need to understand the numbers and things, but still there is like a holistic view you have to take of your whole character to make sure all these little knobs and dials are tuned just right so that the character feels good to play and feels resilient against damage. So that's it for my soapbox. That's my ramble about defenses. Hopefully this has proved useful. I do plan to update this in the future if they make further overhauls of defense, but it should be good for now. Thankfully, we've seen the patch notes for 3.17, so again, unless they've snuck in some kind of major changes without referencing them in the patch notes, which I don't think they have, then this guide should be fully accurate for at least the next few months. So, all that said, good luck to everybody in the next league. I'm super excited. See you guys later. Bye.